Drinking some tea. This is Yogi Kana leaf tea. It's like a bedtime tea. Hey guys, how's it going? Today I wanted to continue my story on how I became a software engineer. If you haven't seen the last video yet, I highly recommend you guys to go ahead and do that. But you don't necessarily have to see that video to understand what's gonna happen and like basically what's going to happen from this point on. In this video, I'm going to cover essentially my time at my bootcamp. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this story. I'm not gonna make it as long as last time, hopefully, but we'll see. So last off, I had just gotten into my bootcamp, and it was my bootcamp was called Dev Bootcamp. It actually, sadly, no longer exists. It closed down sometime like mid last year or so. I was really bummed out about it because I visited the campus after I graduated a couple times. They hosted events every 3 weeks or so when like new cohorts graduated and things like that. But yeah, sadly they closed down, and I could go into the story on bootcamps closing down and what that means for you if you went to a bootcamp, but that's for another time. So my bootcamp was split into 4 phases, phase 0 through phase 3, and I wanted to quickly kind of go over each phase and what my experience was. So one thing that's kind of one question that I get quite often is like, hey, how are bootcamps like? What was your experience? So today I wanted to kind of dive into that topic as well. So phase 0. Phase 0 was actually the longest portion of our bootcamp, but that was because it was part-time and it was also an online portion. So Dev Bootcamp, the entire thing was 18 weeks. They split it to 9 weeks part-time online, which is phase 0. And then they had 3 separate phases, 3 weeks per phase for the full-time, at the campus, right? That's the second 9 weeks or so. So getting into Dev Bootcamp was relatively easy. They just had kind of a screening process where they call you and then they ask you some questions. They're basically checking to make sure that you are legitimate. This is like a path that you really want to go. Because one thing about bootcamps is that it's really intense. It doesn't matter which bootcamp you go to. Those weeks of your life, you literally cannot do anything else. Like, you really need to focus and put in the hours, or you're just not going to be able to learn the things you need to learn to successfully pass the bootcamp. So I got in and I was really proud of myself and yada yada yada. And then I told my wife and everything, and I got started working on the project. So the 9 weeks for phase 0, it looked kind of like this. I came home after work. I pretty much opened my computer and then I coded nonstop. They had like video lessons. Like if you went to like Treehouse or Egghead or any kind of these like structured learning courses online, it was very similar to that. The only difference is that you were required to book some kind of online meeting with some other cohorts who were in phase 0. And this kind of, I'm not sure why they did this, but Dev Bootcamp was actually really big on pair programming. There's pros and cons to pair programming. I might go into another video, but Dev Bootcamp, they truly and wholeheartedly believed in pair programming. So that was like right from the get-go. From phase 0, you had to, every week, at least once per week, you had to reach out to some other cohort in like the Slack or in the shared Slack channel, and then you have to book this thing, and then you have to pair programming. One person has to be the driver and one person has to be the navigator, and those are pair programming terms I could get into another time. But anyway, so that was pretty much it. For 9 weeks, you did that. You learned basic HTML, CSS, some JavaScript, but not much more. You didn't really touch on any frameworks or anything like that. It was really just to get you to start understanding the fundamentals of JavaScript. And I kind of breezed through this course. As I mentioned before in my previous video, I had already been studying programming for about 3 years. So this was actually really easy, and I started to feel like I had wasted my money in a way. I felt like maybe I got like these boot camps weren't going to really teach me a lot of things. Which, you know, in the end, if I reflect back at every point in my journey in my boot camp, I had that kind of thought in my mind the whole time. Partially because I had self-studied so much, but looking back in hindsight, I really treasure this particular moment, this time, this 18 weeks of my life, because I learned so much about programming, and I filled in a lot of holes just from the dedicated time that I had to spend. And if it wasn't for this, it would have took me another year perhaps, or I may have gave up. So you know, in hindsight, it was all well worth it. But yeah, so phase 0 was really straightforward, 9 weeks, you know, easy breezy, right? So that was it. That was 9 weeks of my life. And I had, so this is kind of one thing, I decided to, there's a lot of good boot camps, and even at that time, I don't think Dev Bootcamp was anywhere near like the best boot camps. Hack Reactor, Galvanize, App Academy, those like still like till this day holds the top spots of boot camps in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco area, right? Actually, Galvanize bought Hack Reactor, so I guess it's just Galvanize and App Academy that are like the best. I haven't done my full research on new boot camps for 2 years or so don't quote me on that, but this is just kind of what, this is kind of just my like high level understanding of the landscape right now. Anyways, so that was phase 0. So phase 1 was kind of when things got real. I had not quit my job. So one thing that I think I didn't mention before was one of the main reasons I chose Dev Bootcamp was because this whole 9 weeks part-time and 9 weeks full-time. And I had accrued about 9 weeks of PTO. So I was able to kind of, with very low risk, decide to do this. So I had a pretty good working relationship with my ex-boss, who happened to be the CEO of the company. It was a small company. At the time, I think 80, 90 people or so, maybe a little over 100. But I basically told him, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. I'm thinking about pursuing this. And he was very supportive, and he said, hey, John, instead of quitting, just you know, take your PTO. It's 9 weeks. So after it, if you know, anytime during that time, if you don't want to pursue it, you feel like you made, you know, a choice that didn't really suit you, at least you have this to fall back, your old job to fall back on. So that was actually really helpful for me to take this leap of faith, because I'm pretty risk averse when it comes to these kind of things. So that really helped me kind of push myself to take that leap of faith, essentially. But yeah, so I was essentially officially on PTO, and I started to make my trek up to San Francisco. So San Jose to San Francisco is about an hour worth of time. Probably door to door is like an hour and a half. Sometimes it takes really long. It might be even 2 hours. But I was doing that for a little bit, and luckily my friend Junie lives in San Francisco, so I was able to kind of, Monday through Friday, I just crashed at his place, and then I just went to Dev Bootcamp, which was 5 minutes walk from his place. So I really lucked out then, because I was staying, close to, like, I would go in at like 7:30, 8, and then I would leave close to midnight every day for 9 weeks or so. So anyways, phase 0 started, and wow, it was really crazy. When we got in, when we went to the front door, everyone, like, it was kind of interesting. They gathered everyone out and they kind of had us wait outside, and I met all of my cohorts, essentially. There was about 13, 14 people or so who were in my same cohort. And we were just kind of waiting in the lobby, and this guy, like, they bring us up all together, And then they thinking back, it's kind of funny, but we come in and we get this loud like welcome, and then there's this really narrow hallway, and everyone was lined up on one side, and then they're like told us to walk through and give everyone like high fives, and everyone was like clapping and cheering us up, like cheering us on and things like that, and we got a really nice like DBC welcome essentially. And later I realized that like we do that for every course, which was something kind of special. And just from that moment on, I was like, wow, everyone's like really welcoming, really like the culture here is really friendly, And I feel like that was pretty true all the way to the end of DBC, my bootcamp time. And I felt like the culture of the bootcamp was very like friendly and inclusive. So that was like my first day. We just got a bunch of introductions, and essentially they sat us. They told us exactly how the structure is, and this is kind of how the structure of Dev Bootcamp was. And it's actually pretty similar to a lot of other bootcamps, but basically Dev Bootcamp was split into the full-time portion is split into 3 phases, as I mentioned. Phase 1, which I was in at the time, they covered just raw JavaScript. They just covered raw Ruby, and it was really just to teach you about programming, like how to program. What is a programming language? What's a class? What's methods, like what's getters and setters, like all these programming concepts. That's what they went over. And I was a little shocked because a lot of this we had gone over already in phase 0. I kind of thought that by the time we got to phase 1, we would be actually working on projects and stuff. But that was totally not the case. So I was a little shocked about that. I felt like, oh man, I'm going to spend 3 weeks just learning fundamentals again. That was like kind of my mentality. And it was really interesting, the whole structure of Dev Bootcamp, because they didn't only focus on programming. Like it wasn't just like you get in and you become a rockstar programmer and you get out. That wasn't their entire focus. One of their main other focus was to be like a very social engineer. The way I could put it is that they very highly valued that you are very inclusive and kind of like a nice person as well, not just a good engineer. So they really value that kind of aspect, and it kind of showed. For example, every week, at least like once per week, we had this like group kind of discussion where we talked about like random like social topics like microaggressions and all these other random things that I wasn't really like, I didn't really understand. But yeah, so they were really big on those kind of things. Like we even had to do like mandatory yoga like every Wednesday for an hour or so. And one other thing was that, like I mentioned before, they were really big on pair programming. So every day for like 6 hours or something, we had to pair program. And honestly, to be 100% frank, I like to work alone when it comes to when it comes to programming. I like to work alone, and it was really, really difficult for me to pair program. But I'm glad, in the end, I'm very glad, because I made lifelong friends out of this experience, and I wouldn't have been as close to some of these people, some of my cohort mates, if I didn't, if I wasn't like forced to program with them. And you get, one thing about pair programming is that you always, even though it's really difficult, you always learn something new, and it also teaches you to how to become very humble, because you may think that you know everything, but pair programming is one of the like quickest way for you to realize that you don't know jack crap. Because some people might be just like super better than you. And like I remember this one time because I've been studying for so long, I had this kind of attitude that I knew how to do everything. And I think it rubbed some of my cohort mates the wrong way. That was definitely not my intention, but I I just remember having that mentality, and it's definitely the wrong mentality to have. But nonetheless, I remember this one time I was pair programming with someone that was much older than me. He was actually a lawyer, and I didn't know what to think at the time, because I was trying, here's one thing that you need to know is, in my mind, I was thinking, I just gave up a job. I need to spend as much, like, time is really precious to me at this particular point. I didn't want to waste any time. I was giving up time being with my, like, newlywed wife to be here, right? So this time I was like really serious about that, like not wasting time. I was really, really hardcore, I think. And I remember I was pair programming with someone, and he was a really smart guy, but he was older, so his typing and his like basically the speed at which he was typing was much slower than mine, and that was kind of bothering me. It really shouldn't have. But I remember we were doing a problem with recursion. Like, it was our first day where we were learning about recursion, and this guy, he was just he was like, oh, I think I remember something from math about recursion, and he was like just remembering like random things, and I was like really impressed. And turns out he has a photogenic like memory, and so he was like reading code, and then he would just memorize it. Sure, he typed it slowly, but he was just like regurgitating it. Like, he just memorized it. Like, I was like, wow, this is like incredible. I found out he was a lawyer in his previous job, and he just decided that he wanted to become an engineer because he got bored of being a lawyer. So yeah, so that really humbled me, like that experience. And I try to not show my like whole, like, I need to like not mess around here. I don't want to waste any time. So I got to get like 100% go, So I hope I didn't rub some of my core mates the wrong way. I'm sorry if any of you guys are watching for being a big dick. But yeah, that was phase 0. One thing I didn't mention is that it was probably the most intense phase for me, because it was like literally I was doing this like part-time thing, and then out of nowhere I went like 0 to 60. Basically like 12 plus like 14 hours a day. We were just like 14-hour days, just non-stop coding. We were going crazy just coding, and they would test us every week essentially. They had every week. So the structure of the classes was, in the morning someone will give us some like lecture of some sort on the subject matter, and then the whole afternoon we just did a bunch of problems that was referred around those like lectures. And then at the end of the week we would just get tested. And here's one thing that really shocked me when I got there was that they said at the end of the 3 weeks that you're there for the phase 1, if they're gonna have a final, and if you fail this final, then you have to repeat phase 1. And if you repeat the phase and then you fail again, then they might kick you out. So I was like, what? Like, I didn't know you guys kick people out. It was like, it's crazy to think about, because maybe I didn't read the fine print, but I had no idea that boot camps will kick you out, like if you fail. And I quickly found out this is like pretty standard for every single boot camp. They have like testing like periods, and then they'll kick you out. At least the ones in San Francisco, like the ones that I mentioned. That's a pretty like common like thing that happens. And yeah, I was pretty scared. I was like, oh man, like I don't want to mess this up. Like, it would be really embarrassing and really like shitty if I like tell my wife, hey, like I failed out of the boot camp that I really wanted to go to. I guess I'm not going to be an engineer. I spent all this money. Apparently they give you like a portion of your money back. I don't know the details, because I personally I didn't end up failing out, but I heard there was like some portion you get back. Anyways, yeah, it was a crazy first first it was a crazy first 3 weeks. And the thing is, there was this guy, he was like supposed to be our teacher, but he was like super intense out of nowhere. Like he came in at the last week. Apparently he was one of like the co-founders or something like that, but like he came in last week and he like intimidated a bunch of people for no reason. And then like it was weird. Anyways, phase 1 I passed with flying colors, I guess, and then it was on to phase 2. Phase 2 was where you learn how to build a website. So here was also where I was actually really shocked, because I thought that we were going to be learning Ruby on Rails. That was what it was in the syllabus, I believe, but turns out we weren't going to learn Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails, for those of you guys who don't know, it's just a framework to building websites. And 8 years ago, it was like the hottest thing. Now it's sort of like on the decline, but it's still a lot of startups choose Ruby on Rails because it's kind of like a turnkey situation. All of the architecture decisions are kind of made for you, and you just need to build your website really quickly. So a lot of companies still choose Ruby on Rails. But anyways, I thought we were going to learn Ruby on Rails in phase 2, but turns out we're going to learn something called Sinatra. Sinatra is a lighter weight version of like Ruby on Rails. It's just the web server portion of it. And it's very close to what like Node engineers are familiar with, which is Express. So phase 2 was probably the most phase 2 is probably where I learned the most in terms of like things that I didn't know, because up until that time I felt pretty comfortable with just like programming and stuff. But phase 2 is where I started to learn how to build a website. So here we learned like standard RESTful services. We also learned about MVC, which is Model View Controller. We also learned about Active Record, which is an ORM to manage your like databases. So we also learn SQL and all these kind of things that you learn, you have to know to build a website. We kind of learned during this particular phase. And looking back in hindsight, I remember being like super like, oh, I can't believe we're not learning Ruby on Rails. I need to learn Ruby on Rails. But in hindsight, I'm so glad we did Sinatra first, because I learned, Ruby on Rails is great, but it kind of hides a lot of things, right? For example, to set up routing, you just set up like one route, and it'll create all the CRUD operations behind the scenes. Like it's like black magic, right? But here in Sinatra, you have to define every single one, just like Express. So I really like that particular. In hindsight, I really like that, and this phase was actually really fun. Really felt like it was my money well spent, I guess, because I was learning a lot. And I started to develop some close friendships with a few other core mates, and we're like, hey, let's go to like hackathons. So a few of our cohort members and we signed up for TechCrunch Disrupt, and we're like, okay, this is awesome. So we started planning for TechCrunch Disrupt. But so while we were like kind of planning and like, figuring out what we maybe wanted to build, we found another hackathon that was hosted by Facebook. It was called ChimeHack. And we decided, you know what, let's get practice for TechCrunch. Let's just go to this like hackathon. Like, who knows what's going to happen. So we decided to go. It was literally right after we learned about CRUD operations. We decided to go to this hackathon. We all got there. We were all super excited to be working on like a project. Like we're gonna be like tech, like people, I guess. The prompt of ChimeHack is actually really good. Facebook did a really good job hosting this particular hackathon, but it's essentially figuring out. ChimeHack is sponsored by, I think, Global Citizen. And their aim is to stop like global abuse. They try to they're like a nonprofit that helps try to solve like global issues, like for example sex trafficking, like installing wells and all these kind of things, and they're led by many of these like organizations, prevent like rape prevention and all these kind of stuff, right? So it's actually a really good cause. And the prompt I think at the time was, what do you do when there is like sex trafficking that's happening, or if someone got raped, like what do you do? What kind of hack can you do using technology to solve some of these issues that you see in campuses and like just all around the world? So we got there not knowing much of anything, and we started like whiteboarding like problems. We talked to the judges on what they think might be a good idea, and then we came up with this idea called like Dear Ally. That was the app that we decided to make. And the technology we used was really simple. It's basically what we learned in phase 2. It was a Sinatra app. It was just a simple CRUD website. And one thing that we did special was we integrated with Twilio API. And that's something we learned in phase 2, how to work with APIs. Essentially, the page was one side was allies could sign up, and allies were just professionals that are service vetted, which would be like like a psychologist or something that specializes in talking to victims who are sexually abused, for example. And then the other side was victims, people who needed help. So essentially, when the person who clicked on it, they would get connected to like a Twilio chat. Essentially, it was anonymous, and then they would kind of like talk through problems, and then the person who the ally could send like messages back to them, and then there was like hotline services that they could like send back and things like that. So it's basically just like a chat room. We just created a chat room, but we wrapped it around this kind of concept of preventing, helping out people who were like sexually abused. And I remember when we finished and presented, it was like we were super tired. I stayed up the whole night. It was looking back, like we had like crazy merge conflicts because we didn't know what the heck we were doing. Like every single commit, every single PR, there was a huge commit issue. So I spent so much time just like fixing people's merge issues, going to this computer, fixing, because none of us really knew what we were doing. And I remember my buddy Blake, who actually works with me now, he sits right next to me. There was a point in time, it was like 4 a.m. or something like that. I was like, he was just like committing code. It didn't make any sense. And I was like, Blake, at a certain point, like you're doing more harm than contributing because you're so tired, right? And he was like, yeah, you're right. I think I'm going to go to bed. So he left with some of our other guys. And then I just stayed up rest of the night trying to finish this freaking project. So we finished the project. And then the next day we presented it and all this stuff. And I remember after all the presentations were done, they brought us back to this like stage where they're like going through, like some representative from one of the sponsors would come up and they'll be like, oh, and the winner for the Global Citizen $5,000 like prize was some app, some team. And I was like, I wish there's like a long shot, but I wish we could win. Like I was just like, my heart was beating, and it was like crazy. We're all just like kind of like hoping. But it's a hackathon. The prizes were pretty big, and there was a lot of teams. So I didn't really think we were gonna win. And then I think it was like the last prize.
On behalf of Kleiner Perkins, I'm pleased to announce the winner of the Global Citizenship Award, and that winner is Dear Ally.
Yes! Like we're like super happy, and we were jumping up and down, and like I was just like yes, like cheering, like going crazy. We're all just jumping up and down. Yeah, it was nuts. And then we took some pictures and all this stuff, and yeah, it was fantastic. And then that was like the moment where I realized that winning a hackathon is actually not as hard as you might have imagined. And I have a video on that, you guys could watch it. But yeah, so that actually was phase 2. We came back, that literally was the end of the phase. People were really shocked that we actually won a hackathon. So we kind of started a trend where people went to hackathons, which was actually really cool. So anyways, so that was phase 2. And then phase 3 started, and this was a phase where we started to learn Rails, but the structure of the class was actually, there was no more lectures really. It was more like, hey, we're gonna pretend that you're like working in a real environment. So there was even one, so you're gonna be split into like teams for a few, like for the entire week or something like that, a team of 5 or so, team of like 3 to 5 or so. And then we're gonna give you like real projects. So there was one of my favorite project was like a client project where the head of DVC, the director who is like the principal essentially, he pretended to be a client and gave us like a bunch of like, he basically gave us like a requirement for some app, and then we had to use like Trello and pretend to like do like a sprint kind of thing and plan out a project, and we all like split into teams and we started building stuff with using Ruby on Rails. And the thing is, none of us really knew Ruby on Rails, but because we learned enough about web development and the concepts, we're able to pick it up. And the last, like, I think a week and a half worth of time, we were supposed to just work on our final project. And I remember like we had this like, I don't know, our cohort, everyone was like super nice. I really liked pretty much everyone in our cohort, but I think I probably, rubbed some people the wrong way because I was very like I said, I was like, I had this mentality, like I'm giving up a lot of my time and being away from my wife and all this kind of stuff. I had it like in my mind, I absolutely cannot waste any time. And by this time, I had already gotten to work very closely with the people I went to like hackathons with. So of course I wanted to do like my final project with them because I already knew their working styles a lot more than everyone else. But like there was a rule where you didn't really get to choose who you work with before. It was more like people suggest projects, like, and then everyone votes on a project, and if you voted for a project that like you wanted to work on, then you worked on that project. And of course there was like, that's why you had to like vote on multiple projects. But like basically we had this like whole conversation outside where I was like, dude, like just let us work with people that we want to work with, because this is what we're gonna figure out a way to do this anyways. And we had this whole conversation. It was kind of dramatic, but and in hindsight, I don't think I should have done it, like should have pushed for that so much, but I was just kind of like, I need to do this my way. Like I had this like kind of really, really intense like thought process that I need to work with people that I knew exactly how they're gonna work because I have worked with them in the hackathon. So that was kind of like my driving force for that decision, and I kind of regret some of that because I was kind of a dick. The cool thing that I could say about my bootcamp experience is that pretty much everyone who went through my bootcamp, who was in my cohort, have awesome jobs now. So things all worked out in the end. So we started working on this like final project, and this project that we decided to make was called The Partner. The Partner was essentially like an idea that my friend, two of my friends, Tedman and Blake, decided to create. They were in my cohorts. It's essentially we found out that AWS had released a bunch of like, I think it's some like tax form for nonprofits, and it told them like how much like executives made and all these kind of like different meta information about nonprofits. So we thought, hey, what if we like kind of parsed every single one of these documents, made our own database, and then we could create like this like website where people could type in some nonprofit that they were interested in, and they could see some like information about their spending habits and all these other things, right? So we thought maybe we could create this website. So that was essentially the website. We did a bunch of fancy things, and we used React, and we used like a Rails backend and all this stuff, and it was a lot of fun. I remember even going to like the AWS like pop-up booth to get like to ask questions about it, because we didn't really know how to use AWS. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. The project was really intense. I think, again, I stayed up all night the last day tidying up the project. Oh man, I stayed up all night so many times during this entire process. I kind of breezed over this, but during this time, sometime between phase 2 and phase 3, we also won TechCrunch Disrupt, which was amazing because there was literally hundreds of teams there. We also won this other hackathon that was hosted by our bootcamp, actually, called Hack Against Violence. We actually won that hackathon as well. So we were feeling like we're on top of the world, and essentially we're gonna like kill it, right? So phase 3 ended very quickly. It was like a blink of an eye. We just finished our project. I stayed up the whole night. Our friend, my friend Tedman gave the presentation, and yeah, my family was there to see me finish the project. My friend Junie was there. I think Andrew was there too. And yeah, I finished my bootcamp, and we went to this like, we went to the Magic School Bus, we call it, which is like this place in San Francisco where it's like an outdoor, like on the grid, like food truck area, and we rented out like a school bus, and then we just had some drinks and all this kind of stuff, and yeah, we were done with the bootcamp. And I feel like, looking back, I wouldn't trade this time in my life for anything. You know, it was pretty expensive, like 13 grand, and I learned a shit ton about programming, but more importantly, I made really good friends. And yeah, I do look back at this moment in my life very fondly. And one thing that I would like to say is, you know, when you go to like these boot camps, whatever boot camps that you go to, because you spend so much time with your cohorts, and like boot camps in itself, you spend so much time in that environment, and it's really hard. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. And you know, I breezed over a lot of the good parts, but there was a lot of, you know, tough parts too. You know, we lost a few members because they weren't able to, you know, get the material fast enough. So some people got held back, some people had to leave. Yeah, there was a lot of sad moments. You know, it's not all roses. You know, a lot of people go through a lot of stressful time. That's why there was even like a mandatory counseling session you had to do once per week. But it was tough. You know, we're putting in like hours and hours and hours of work. But you meet some really interesting people, and you meet some like lifetime friends essentially. And I always wondered why. I'll explain this a little bit more in the next video when I talk about my job search. But one thing about graduating a bootcamp is that more often than not, when you reach out to someone who went to the same bootcamp as you, they'll respond back. And the reason, and it's not like this if you went to like some school, right? Let's say you went to some university, and I'm not talking about like a master's program, like an MBA, because that's kind of the purpose of MBAs. But I'm talking about like, let's say I went to UC Santa Cruz. So if I reached out to someone who went to UC Santa Cruz, chances are, at least for me, most often than not, they won't respond back. But for bootcamp grads, most often than not, they'll respond back. It's because I think it really has to do with the fact that you have this like shared experience, and you know immediately what this person went through because you went through the same thing. And that's why when I see someone who graduated from like Dev Bootcamp, I 100%, almost 100% respond back. As long as I see the message, right? Because this is our network. This bootcamp, when you go to a bootcamp, you're not only paying for the lessons and the knowledge that they give you, but you're paying for this network that you're part of, that will be there for you for the rest of your tech journey and your career. So, looking back and looking at the amount that I paid, everything was totally worth it. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this particular portion of this part 2 of the story. It looks like I'm going to need a part 3 to talk about my job search. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys next time.